I'm Kelsey Moser, and you're watching Thorin's YouTube channel, where no sandbagging goes unscrutinized.
When people discuss the concept of geolocation as part of the future trajectory for eSports as a potential mainstream sporting endeavor, competitive discipline, entertainment medium, whatever you will bill it as. Obviously, within the Overwatch League, this is a centrally planned component of why the league should be worth a lot of money in the future, why people should buy into certain slots and pay extra money to get those ones, why they want to partner with certain traditional sports franchises who have established markets and roots already within those areas in terms of local sponsorships and deals and know how to appeal to those crowds. For the LCS at the moment, we don't see any future moving towards geolocation, but we know over in the LPL in League of Legends in China, they're already in the process of making each of the big teams have a different city within China, and they're going to have home and away games there. Now, when it comes to this aspect of geolocation, tying a team, a franchise to one spot in the world, particularly in this case, mainly going to be a city of note somewhere in North America or in Europe at one point in time, or in the case of the LPL, China as a country. People often bill it as something that either hasn't been tried and therefore you can't know if it's going to succeed, or something that because it's succeeded in sports is the way things have to be done here, or something that we have to move towards to succeed one day in esports and get it to the level of sports. But one aspect I thought I'd bring up in this video is that surely South Korea actually is a case against geolocation being a viable proposition or something that actually is a trajectory that realistically esports can head towards. Because South Korea has always been billed and sold as the mecca of esports. Now, I made a point in another video how it's really Seoul that's the case for. South Korea as a general country, certain parts of it completely barren. There's barely anything going on except what goes on in Seoul, the majority of it, and then the odd final that takes place in Busan or somewhere equivalent to that. But it's always been sold and overhyped as like, this is where esports got huge. And in the, in the like 2000s, these guys were like soccer stars there, and everyone was watching on TV, and people were making like $400,000 salaries. But you know what? The elements of it that do bear up in terms of like it being the mecca of esports is it was on TV channels there, two big TV channels, years and years ago. We're talking about in the early 2000s. They've had persistent studio setups, the OGN studio and BC Game studio, where you go there, you play in the same booths every week, you play the same warm-up match backstage, you play in the same sort of crowd setup. Then, as a result, the production elements can all be very, very consistent. They've had, through these tournaments like OSLs, MSLs, OGN, LCK, the Overwatch League, Contenders, Apex, you've had these regular league games where fans can attend. You can have fan clubs of people who go to the game together collectively to cheer and to provide support. The actual attendance for games has actually at times been consistent. So for a lot of the Korean games that weren't big finals or massive playoff matches, we're talking about 150 to 400 people, depending on how popular the teams playing are, depending on how much of a hot ticket marquee matchup it is. So actually not very big numbers in terms of the regular attendance there. It's nothing compared to a big sporting event. And for finals, depending on the game, depending on the era, depending on the particular matchup, we're talking about between 5,000 and 10,000 particular viewers. Sure, there were times like that classic picture people quote from I think 2006 or 2005 where they're all on the beach in Busan. I think there might have been 50,000 there, 40,000 there. That might be a big number, but that was a one-off. That was an outlier. That wasn't what the other OSL finals or League of Legends or GN finals were like, or Apex finals were like. They were more in the range of 5 to 10,000 viewers. And this is the top end of a scene that's been developed for over 10 years now. We're talking about, in fact, approaching 20 years at this point in time, at least 15 years where they've had a lot of these things in place. Then add in, Seoul is a city with over 9 million people population. It has more people by population than New York City. Korea itself only has 50 million people, and Seoul accounts for almost a fifth of the entire country's population in its borders alone. So why haven't they been able to make Seoul, to make these particular games being played there, something that they could pivot and make the audiences bigger. Why couldn't they geolocate even an entire league, an entire competitive discipline to one city and make it succeed there by having big viewership? Why didn't they have the huge audiences? I mean, this is an entire league, an entire game within a country, geolocated to one place, and a place, by the way, where we're talking about 9 million people, with a massive potential to gain viewership, to have a lot of people follow. Never mind the fact that if you go with an approach outside of Korea and what they're trying to do in the West or in the LPL, they're going to have single teams attached to a single city. So now in theory, only fans of that team are going to go to the stadium and watch that particular match. You're making it even more of a niche of what esports is within the gaming niche of the world as it is. Now, that's adding in the fact that some teams will be smaller, some places will be smaller, some places will be smaller and less based around entertainment and around going out and paying for tickets to something. Then add in South Korea in the heyday of esports in StarCraft Brood War and more recently in League of Legends has had legitimately huge corporations as main sponsors, as owners of teams. SK Telecom, huge telecom company. KT Rolster, huge telecom company. Samsung, maker of like half the phones around the world, massive company for loads of electronics. CJ, not a company people are going to know outside their Korea, but a massive chaebol within Korea that owns, for example, on GameNet itself, numerous other corporations. If these people have the backing behind it, and either they don't see any point in putting more investment in to get more viewers, to build it up more, or they simply can't, it makes you have to question if it's even possible, right? Because when you look at esports, including Korea, it's not as big as people make out. Like in Korea, I have to say this, whenever I've asked people anecdotally about why they think StarCraft Brood War was really big in like the mid-2000s, because by the way, it leveled up again towards the end of the 2000s, a lot of them said to me, it was a cultural fad. It was the equivalent of Pokemon cards or Pogs or something, or people playing with yo-yos for a few years back in the 90s. It's something that everyone was doing for a year or two. Everyone got super into, everyone was saying they were loving it, but then it wore off, and because it was a fad, it just went along and everyone went to the next fad, and all of a sudden it was half as big, it was a quarter as big. Likewise, people often told me it's something you did as a teenager, it's something you did when you were 12, it's something you did when you were 14 before you had to really focus on school or go off and get a job or do university. So it's a teenager thing. So for games like League of Legends and Overwatch, I think this absolutely fits after the fad of StarCraft Brood War, that yeah, lots of teenagers are into League of Legends, lots of teenagers were playing Overwatch when it came out, and as a result you get a lot of young guys who are following the best team or the best player, and you get a lot of girls who make up those fan clubs who you see who very diligently go along and make cakes for the players and make signs and support their players. Some of them in some cases probably because they're good players, others like they'd support a pop idol, like they'd support for someone from BTS, or they'd support Girls' Generation if they want to support a female set of icons as well. Then you got to look at the factor that, just like in the West, in South Korea, people watch esports games online. They don't just go and have to watch from a stadium to be able to appreciate the game. Online, you get to have the comfort of sitting in your own home, watching whenever you decide to tune in, tuning out whenever you're not interested anymore, watching a game while doing something else on your computer, on a second monitor, or on another tab, during the break or during the downtime between the draft. You can go and surf on the internet. There are a lot of benefits to surfing and watching these games from home, and you don't get as much if you go in person. In fact, I've always thought most esports games suffered in terms of trying to build up the live fan base from the fact that in many ways the best seat in the house is at home. You have a better view of the screen, you can see the contrast better without all the spotlights. Sure, you don't get the atmosphere. Sure, you don't get to see the players with your own eyes walk out. You don't get to see the emotion or feel sort of like a cool moment in the crowd beyond just hearing it on the stream. But you also see the majority of the game, get the majority of the viewing experience just by watching a screen at home, in the same way as if you're at the venue, you're watching a screen. That's a flaw in itself, I've always thought. So there are many reasons as to why geolocation hasn't particularly taken off in Korea. Admittedly, they didn't just try one team, but they tried the entire league. You'd think they'd be combining all the fans together, and they could only get a few hundred for each regular season game, and then they could only get it, we're talking like thousands to at most we're talking 10,000, a little bit more for the massive matches that were like era-defining games and finals between the biggest teams, the biggest supported squads, the most famous players of all time. And except for the period when it was a cultural fad. So I think a lot of these factors, I don't say geolocation can't work. I don't know that. I certainly think if it does work in the West, it's going to take a different approach to traditional sports or what's been done in esports. But I think Korea is worth pointing out as kind of like a test case of like, why weren't they able to make geolocation work if it's going to work in the Overwatch League or the LCS or the LPL? This video was kindly supported by Andreas, Snazore, Westerlund, Dean Tanglis, Gardner Wilson, Landon Thompson, NateDOhDoubleG, Kyla Harris, Travis Greb, James Harding, Daniel Yordanov, VeXii, Robert Baxter, and a special thanks goes out as always to Jerky's Minion. Do you want to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? Would you like to ask me a question in my monthly AMA? Would you fancy a few teasers for what's coming up in my content? How about taking part in an esports discussion with me? We'll put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrilluminati today at the Patreon link in the description box below.